Welcome to the Landscape Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Heiler. I'm the founder and CEO of Landscape Leadership. If you own or work for a company in the lawn and landscape industry, you're in the right place. This is where we share our candid thoughts on sales and marketing as it relates to companies just like yours. So thank you for joining me. And today we're going to spend a little time talking about advertising. Now, maybe a few of you know that Elon Musk of Tesla just moved to Austin, Texas not long ago. He relocated from California. And actually, from what I hear, he owns a house. It's probably not even a mile away from me in an old neighborhood just down the street, actually. So kind of interesting. Maybe I'll see him out walking around. Anyway, did you know that Tesla does not have an advertising budget? Which is kind of interesting. And I'm gonna come back to that because that's gonna be our topic today, is talking about advertising. And we're gonna start with a question that I got from a client of ours. This is somewhat recently. And this client, they're a landscape design build company, and they also do some maintenance. But they're really known for design build work. And they were launching or starting a new lawn care division. They said, Chris, we just started a lawn care division. Should we start aggressively advertising our new lawn care services? And if I recall, they were considering print ads, so like in a magazine. They were going to do a postcard mailing, and they were even talking about a radio campaign to support this new division. And the reasoning was simple enough, right? It was get the word out to as many people as possible, right? They had a new division that they needed to grow. However, my answer was a big no, and for two reasons. And this goes back to my 10 rules of advertising, which I've written about in the past. I'm going to link to that in the show notes. But there's two rules that apply in this situation. Rule number 2 and rule number 5. And rule number 2 of advertising is advertising cannot build a brand. Okay, and I will restate that as advertising cannot build a new division or a new service. Advertising cannot make an obscure brand well known, nor can it effectively launch a new brand or launch a new service or launch a new division. Okay, and I'll get more into this in a few minutes. But the second reason I said no is because of rule number 5, which is advertising cannot change minds. If your landscaping business is known for one thing, you cannot become known for something else simply by advertising and trying to throw money at it. The company we're talking about, this client of ours, first and foremost, they're a creative design build company. That's how they're known. They're really not even known as a maintenance company, although they do some of that. They're certainly not known for lawn care. And no amount of advertising is going to change that. And that's exactly what I told them. I said, instead of spending a lot of money on advertising, focus on selling those lawn care services to your existing customer base and increasing the value of those accounts. Do that first. As you guys know, if you've ever launched a new service, you're going to have some hiccups along the way. So you might as well work out the kinks on customers who already trust you, right? Rather than advertising to an audience that you have zero credibility with. And we're going to talk a lot more about credibility. So that was a question that I got from an old client of ours. Now we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about these rules of advertising that I mentioned. I covered 2 of them. I'm not going to go into each one on this podcast, but if you want to dig deeper into these yourself, just check out the article that's in the show notes. So let's dive in. Rule number 1, advertising has no credibility. I just mentioned this. Think about it. Do you believe anything you see or hear in an advertisement? I doubt it. Neither do your prospects. That's because advertising has as much credibility as a message inside a fortune cookie. 0. So no matter how meaningful and creative your advertising, prospects are still going to see it as a paid message from a landscaping company just looking to make a sale, right? I mean, that's how we look at advertising. This reminds me of, I think it was 2010. You guys remember that It was the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. It was obviously a big deal down here in Texas. Before that incident, British Petroleum, BP, that was the company that had this major spill, they were spending millions of advertising dollars trying to convince consumers that they were an environmentally friendly company. And I believe Beyond Petroleum was their corporate slogan at the time. I mean, do you think anybody bought into that? That BP was an environmentally friendly company? Of course not. I mean, and that was before this disaster. So after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, BP spent millions more trying to convince people that they were going to clean up the mess, right? So no matter how much they spent on advertising, they were never going to have credibility before or after the disaster. Nobody believes a big company like BP is environmentally friendly, right? Advertising has no credibility. Rule number 2, we touched on this. Advertising cannot build a brand. It doesn't matter how much money you spend on advertising. Without the necessary credibility, you cannot build a successful brand today. This is not the 1950s or the 1960s Mad Men era. Consumers are a hell of a lot smarter today. And honestly, I mean, that's what happens when you've been burned by manipulative advertising for decades, right? You become more savvy. So like I said earlier, advertising cannot make an obscure brand or company well known, nor can it effectively launch a new brand or company. This is especially true for startup local service businesses like landscape companies, lawn care operators, tree care companies, you name it. A landscaping business is built by other means. Typically, it's word of mouth and recommendations from friends, relatives, peers. It's professional contacts. It's connections with the media, things like that. That's why public relations and networking are so important for young companies. Even the biggest brands in the world today were not built by advertising. They were built by PR. Tesla, I mentioned earlier, is the perfect example of that. Tesla doesn't even have an advertising budget. They've been built on PR. It's all word of mouth and media attention. So rule number 3, this goes along with number 2. Number 2 is advertising cannot build a brand. Rule number 3 is the purpose of advertising is to maintain a brand. Starbucks spent less than $10 million on advertising in its first 10 years. They solely relied on publicity to grow their brand, just like Tesla's doing now. Walmart, Microsoft, Google, all did the same. But today, all of these companies advertise. Even Amazon, I've seen Amazon start advertising recently, maybe in the last couple of years. I see television ads. But even in the early days of Amazon, they certainly didn't advertise. So what you need to understand is that these companies don't advertise to build their brand. They advertise to defend their brand from competition and to stay top of mind with consumers. So if you're a new company, you have no position to protect or defend, right? I mean, you're not at the top of anybody's mind. So advertising should always come after your landscape business has achieved a strong position in your market, not before. Rule number 4, advertising must reinforce the position already in the mind of your prospects. Al Ries said it best. He said, advertising is the cheerleader that repeats words and ideas that already exist in the mind. Advertising is the cheerleader that repeats words and ideas that already exist in the mind. If your landscaping company is perceived in a certain way, then your advertising needs to back up those perceptions. Don't try to be something you're not. So this applies to the client that I mentioned earlier who launched a lawn care division. In the mind of their customers and prospects, they're a landscaping company, right? They're not a lawn care company. So if they're bent on spending money to advertise, then they should use advertising to reinforce the position as a leading design build company. not use advertising to promote their new service because that's not what they're known for. So this ties into our next rule, which we talked about briefly earlier, which is rule number 5, and that is advertising cannot change minds. If your business is known for one thing, you cannot become known for something else simply by advertising, no matter how much money you're willing to spend. This rule and the previous, this reminds me of a garden center that I worked for when I was in college. This was one of the first jobs I had in the landscaping industry. So this garden center was owned by 2 brothers. And these guys knew exactly how they were perceived by their customers. They were known for having the cheapest plants around. And they did not shy away from this. Like, they embraced it, even in their advertising. So they knew they weren't going to change anyone's minds and suddenly become known for this garden center that carries quality plants. Because they knew they were already known for cheap plants. So when they advertised, and they did, they advertised the fact that they had cheap plants. They would sell, I don't know, like 3-gallon perennials for $10 or something like that. They would just sell these really cheap plants. And that's how they would advertise. And they advertised to reinforce the position that they already owned in the mind of their customers and prospects. So if you're known for something, own it. All right? Own it. Let's see. I'm going to skip rules 6 and 7. I'm going to wrap up talking about rule number 8, and I'm going to skip 9 and 10. So let's focus on rule number 8, which is actually very misunderstood in our industry. Advertising is not an investment. All right? As we've already established, advertising does not build brands. Advertising maintains brands. You use advertising to protect and defend your position, just like those other companies I talked about, Google, Amazon. Companies make a big mistake when they treat advertising as an investment and they expect a healthy return on that investment. What you need to understand is that advertising is rarely worth what it costs, except for the leading companies who use it to protect and defend their brand from competitors, like I've talked about, okay? So companies like Walmart and Microsoft, they don't expect a return on all those millions of dollars that they've spent on advertising, at least not in the traditional sense. I mean, they treat the expenditure as insurance. They're simply staying top of mind with consumers and protecting themselves against their competitors. They treat it like insurance. I wrote about this in the article I published on Landscape Leadership it was probably a week, maybe 10 days ago, something like that. So you might want to dig into that. I'll share that in the show notes as well. In that article I mentioned, if you're contemplating a radio advertising campaign, let's say it's $20,000, the primary question that you're asking should not be, are we going to sell $80,000 worth of work so we can make back that $20,000, right? That's the classic ROI question. Are we going to spend, if we spend this much, are we going to make this much back? That's not how you want to look at traditional advertising. Again, and that's the wrong question. So again, advertising, it's more like insurance. It's to protect you. And that's why you only want to spend money on advertising when you are the leader in the marketplace, because you have something to defend at that point. So then it's worth paying for that. Really, the question to ask is whether or not your ads are going to reach the right audience. That's the first question. And then assuming that to be the case, then your strategy, if you choose to advertise, should be to promote and reinforce your leadership position that's already in the mind of the consumers, which is rule number 4 that we talked about. So that garden center I worked at, their position in the mind of the consumers was they sell cheap plants. So, okay, they decide they want to spend some money on advertising. Well, then that's what they better advertise, is cheap plants, not try to advertise something else. Okay? I hope that makes sense. Advertising is not an investment. It's more of an insurance policy. Okay. Like I said, I'm going to skip. That was rule number 8. I'm going to skip 9 and 10. You'll find that article in the show notes if you want to dig into each of these a little further. I hope this insight was helpful to you guys. I love talking about advertising. It's so tantalizing. It's so tempting to spend money on it, right? Because you get to see this polished and produced best version of yourself, or this best version of your company. It really feeds the ego. But along with that, like we just mentioned, there's some pitfalls, which we talked about today. So if you guys have more questions about advertising, you want a little more clarity on some of these things I talked about, you can email me directly and I'd be happy to get back to you. Just email me at chris.heiler@landscapeleadership.com. So thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. Consider forwarding this to a colleague or a peer if you think they would find it valuable. If you're listening on iTunes, it'd be awesome if you could leave us a review. That helps more people find the podcast. So thank you again, and we'll talk to you next time. Have a great week.